Hi, I'm Marcus Haley, your Dean of Formation. Now, prior to me being ordained to the priesthood, I did a lot of school.
A lot of school.
I learned about the history of the Christian church from Palestine to North Africa to Europe to all corners of the world. I learned about the transforming presence of black Christians, particularly in the context of the Americas. I learned about the intricacies of the Book of Common Prayer, how to say what prayers when, and I totally learned and mastered how to be a non anxious presence in pastoral situations. I did realize one gap in my formation, though, when I became a rector in a congregation. I learned that I had been taught how to lead a vestry meeting, but I hadn't actually been taught how to be a leader, particularly in communities overwhelmed with anxiety in the face of change. Our faith communities need leadership that enables them to live faithfully as Christian disciples in the midst of a rapidly changing world, and that often means embracing discomfort. And for leaders, it's kind of hard to hold that space. Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky write that leadership is disappointing people at the rate they can absorb. Leadership is disappointing people at the rate they can absorb. Now, needless to say, there is so much to unpack just in that one sentence alone. But even on its surface, that kind of leadership is incredibly challenging and difficult. And that kind of leadership is key to living out the priestly vocation in community. As part of our Formation Colleagues group, we are about to begin a module on leadership, where we are going to read and explore different models of leadership that will enable us to be the best leaders we can be for the sake of God's mission. To begin, I had a wonderful conversation with a friend, the Reverend Christine Lee, priest in charge of St. Peter's Church in Chelsea, New York, who embodies the priesthood as a woman of color in a rapidly changing church. And I think she has a lot of wisdom to teach and share with us. After this conversation, we'll circle back for some reflection and some next steps. Well, good morning, Christine. How are you?
Good morning, Marcus. I'm doing well.
Good. How are things in New York these days?
Oh, well, this past weekend we had amazing, beautiful,
Yeah.
unseasonably warm weather.
Yeah.
So that has definitely like lifted all of our spirits. And of
Yeah, for
course,
sure.
Saturday was crazy. we had it was actually funny because we had our diocesan convention
Hmm.
on Saturday. And literally, I felt so bad for Bishop Shin because he started speaking and then suddenly you started hearing all this cheering outside our window. And like literally, I think at that point he just lost everybody, and we're all like looking up, like, what happened? But New York was nuts on
Yeah.
Saturday.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how was it in Connecticut?
It was a little bit more subdued, but I think
Yeah,
it was the Connecticut version of nuts, right? Like I was sitting in my house and like I'm just like mindlessly doing something. I don't even know what I was doing. And all of a sudden I hear like
yeah,
all these like car horns and like all I'm
yeah.
like, what is going on? And I walk
Hmm.
outside and there's like all this like commotion, and I'm like, oh, I know exactly what just happened.
Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah, but the weather's been good here too.
Yeah.
I know it got really cold a bit last week, and I was like, "Oh, it's that like entry into winter, and like here we go, like hunker down."
Yeah. Yeah.
We got like just warm enough for me to go outside and plant some bulbs and like do a
Oh,
little bit of last minute gardening. So like I'm in my happy
yeah.
place right now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I felt like I like really slept for the first time, like
yeah,
on Saturday night.
yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Well, I think that's such a wonderful segue into I think what we're going to be talking about today, which is really
Mhm.
about leadership. And I think it's to me, it's always an appropriate topic in the church, but I think especially in not only the days that we've just experienced, but in the months, years ahead, like what it means to lead communities during
Yeah.
this time. But so I know you a little bit, but I wonder if you could
Mhm.
just tell the folks who are going to be watching this a little bit about who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your sort of spiritual journey, how you got to where you are in your journey with God.
Yeah. So let's see, where shall I start? Well, so I'm Korean American, second generation. My parents were immigrants to the U.S. Back in the '60s. So my sisters and I were all born and raised here. Born in Indiana, grew up in Maryland, and my dad was a pastor of a large Korean Presbyterian church in Baltimore for most of my growing up years. So I'm a PK. And like a lot of PKs, just grew up in the church, going to Sunday school, kind of knowing all the Sunday school answers. But I think really coming to genuine faith and relationship with Christ in high school. And I went on this very consequential short-term missions trip, which I know, missions trips have sort of mixed reviews about like how effective or helpful they are, which I totally get. But it ended up being this very life-changing experience. So we went to Haiti, and I think just seeing, like, I had never encountered just poverty and suffering in
Mm,
such an in-your-face way before. So that was one thing. But then also, I think just being so inspired by the missionaries who were there and then the Haitian Christians who were there. And
yeah,
there was also, I also just feel like it was my first encounter with even some more like miraculous, just sort of miraculous
sure.
things that happened in the process. And so after that, I basically decided I want to become a missionary
Hmm.
and was pretty dead set on doing that. And then that was happening at the same time, like being a PK, like a lot of times PKs, sadly end up walking away from the church and faith
Sure.
because of what they experienced, like hypocrisy in their parents.
Hmm.
And thankfully, my parents were not like that. Like
Hmm.
they actually set a really good example for us. I think even though they were busy with the church, they never made us feel like we were overlooked or
Hmm.
number two. So I think I always grew up with a kind of love for the church and
Hmm.
a desire to serve in some way, shape, or form. So I went to a Christian college in Chicago thinking that I was going to become an overseas missionary, but
Hmm.
then God kind of directed me differently. And
Yeah.
it came to another sort of conversion moment where I remember like our school had this yearly missions conference, and
Hmm.
the speaker there said something like, when we give our lives to Christ, we're basically writing him a blank check,
Hmm.
and saying, okay, whatever you want to do with my life, like
Mm.
I'm willing to go there. And I remember it was funny because everybody else was like, I don't want to go overseas as a missionary, but maybe God's calling me. And I'm like, I want to go overseas as a missionary, but you might be calling me to stay. And so I just remember like at that point, just remember like crying and really feeling a sense of God saying, Christine, are you willing to do whatever and go wherever you
Mhm.
want? I want you to go. So
Mhm.
kind of laying that down. And then that kind of led me, I don't want to talk you through every year of my life, but generally, that ended up leading me to seminary, which I had
Yeah.
not been planning on going to actually.
Mhm.
And then I ended up getting my MDiv at a school called, not Trinity, not the Episcopal Trinity, but it's
Mhm.
an evangelical free seminary in Chicago. That's
Mhm.
essentially where all the Koreans went.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And so, so I think just was open to and seeking where it is that God was calling me in
Mhm.
ministry. And okay, I should speed this up. There's a couple other things, but essentially, what it led me to was campus ministry. So I
Yeah.
ended up serving with campus ministry for a while. I met my husband Jimmy while I was serving at the University of Chicago,
Mhm.
and then he was the one who introduced me to the Episcopal Church.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I found myself at an Episcopal church here in New York City called All Angels,
Mhm.
and that was really my first foray into liturgy and the
Yeah.
sacraments and all of that stuff. And I think at the time, like I mean, as you might guess from like being Korean and Christian, Korean Christians tend to be more evangelical, more
Mhm.
conservative, and a lot of emphasis about like preaching. So like our sermons would be like 45 minutes long. It's like that kind of place. And but then coming to the Episcopal Church, it was just so strange. And so
Mhm.
I was actually really judgy
Yeah.
about the Episcopal Church. I was like, you know, like 15-minute sermons, what? You're barely past your first point, and that and like I didn't really get the whole sacramental
Mhm.
thing either. But at All Angels, my husband and I attended the evening service,
Mhm.
which had a lot of folks who are homeless who were
Mhm.
there. And I think it was really at that service that I began to experience the power of the sacraments.
Mhm.
And even just that experience of coming around a common cup together with people just from so many different backgrounds. What ended up happening was would just start uncontrollably weeping
Yeah.
during the Eucharist.
Yeah. Same.
And yeah, yeah. And so I think that just opened me up in
Yeah.
a new sort of way. And so then from that point on, it was my priest approached me about going through the discernment process for ordination. And here I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there are parts of your story I really, really resonate with, and there are these moments of like conversion, right? That I really resonate with as you were sharing. So there's not only my experience of like literally openly weeping the first time I took the Eucharist and like being like what's happening right now, like I didn't have
Right.
an awareness. But also like you and I met at a really like a moment of conversion in my own life. Like I was in a parish serving, and honestly, I was in over my head and didn't quite know how to articulate that, right? Like I was leading a church that was undergoing a lot of change and I wasn't quite sure how to lead them. And so you and I met like in New York City as you were putting together that conference. And I've shared with you, like I think like face to face and like over email, like that moment, that conference, and specifically the time when you prayed with me at the end of that conference was really a conversion moment for me, because it really helped me to see like what I'm actually called to do in this moment is to be a leader, and to lead in a particular way that isn't, frankly, it's not what I was taught in seminary, right? Like the leadership that I'm called to in this parish isn't what they taught me in seminary. It's a new kind of leadership. It's a different kind of leadership. It's a more nimble kind of leadership. It's adaptive leadership, right? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about adaptive leadership and where you see that in your work as a parish priest.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was introduced to adaptive leadership through this book called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. I don't know if your folks are going to be reading that or not.
Yeah.
But so what was interesting about that book is that when the person who recommended it to me did not tell me anything about how it was about adaptive leader. Like I had no conception of what that was. And all he said was, I think this is a good book for people who don't identify as alpha male leaders, which was my primary sort of profile for what I like. My dad he's gentle spirited, but he's definitely an alpha.
Sure.
And that's often the model that you see put out there of like what a good leader is or what you're supposed to be like.
Yeah.
And so I'd always heard like, okay, a leader is somebody who takes people from here to there. But I often felt like, I'm not exactly sure where there is. Like, I know it has something to do with the Great Commission and like making disciples and all that kind of stuff. But like, I often felt so sort of like lost and like I was just trying to figure things out. And so when I read this book, I think I've told Todd, who's now my professor, this. I was like, I feel like this was like the leadership book that I was looking for my whole life, because it kind of articulated how I function normally.
Yeah.
And so, one thing one thing they say about adaptive leadership is that they're saying, like as a leader, you have to be able to say those three hardest words, I don't know.
Yes.
because it really is, like the subtitle to that book is Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory.
Yep.
So it's having to admit the world is changing so rapidly.
Yep.
Like who knows what it's going to look like a year from now or 5 years from now. And so, like the nimbleness of it and the ability to be able to quickly adapt. So just in general, so adaptive leadership takes the metaphor of evolution and this idea of a living organism and how it adapts to the changing environment around it.
Yeah.
So what we want to kind of look at or get to what's the essential DNA that really is like the identity of that organism. What DNA needs to be discarded so that it can adapt and thrive in the new environment. What new DNA needs to be reimagined or recreate or created for that adaptation. And then hopefully it's not just about survival, but really about thriving.
Sure.
And but I think then another piece of it is they would say, because things are constantly changing, we don't know. That's a little bit of a hallmark too of adaptive leadership. So there's this distinction between technical problems and adaptive challenges. So a technical problem would be something where it's like, okay, here's like there's expertise that's out there, like somebody could solve this problem. So you take, for example, the pandemic, so all right, suddenly we're not able to gather in person. And so even though it's a really hard technical problem, you know, a lot of churches had to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to have worship
Yeah.
online?
Yeah.
But, you know, somebody can show us how to use Facebook Live, you know,
Sure.
somebody can
Sure.
show us how to use Zoom. So that's really, in some ways, like a technical problem. But the
Mhm.
adaptive challenge are those larger questions of what does it mean to be the church
Yeah.
in a world where we cannot gather physically?
Yeah.
And what does membership and belonging mean
Mhm.
when we're no longer bound by geographic,
Mhm.
you know, geographic borders, even in
Yeah.
some ways, areas. So because there isn't expertise that's out there that we can automatically apply, and it's kind of unknown, there are some, you know, they talk about three kind of major features of adapt, and they say it always involves learning of some
Yeah.
kind. So there's the kind of beginner's mind, like, I don't know how to learn this.
Mhm.
And then also along with that is loss. And
Mhm.
that's a big deal with adaptive change and leadership, is leading people, I mean, confronting your own sense of loss as
Yep.
well as leading other people through loss. And so Ron Heifetz and Martin Linsky are the ones who kind of coined that phrase.
Mhm.
And they talk about how people don't resist change, they resist loss.
Yeah.
And that was so helpful to me.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, where it's not just like, oh, you're just being difficult, or you're just stuck in like,
Yeah.
you're just like, you don't want these to, it's like, no, there's grief that's there that's
Yeah.
maybe not even recognized by
Yeah.
us. And yeah, who wants to, nobody wants to grieve. Nobody wants to go through
Right.
loss. So there's that piece. And then the third piece of it is they talk about a gap in values and
Yeah.
behavior. So being able to see like, okay, we have, they talk about actual versus aspirational values. So the aspirational values is everyone's like, all right, we think like evangelism is important, or you know, something else is important.
Yeah.
But then our actual values is about, but there's absolutely nothing in our behavior that actually
Yeah.
supports that we value what we say we
Yeah.
wish we were doing. So those are kind of like the sort of the basics of adaptive leadership. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but
Yeah.
then I think what it ends up becoming is really thinking more from like a systemic perspective, and particularly about leading a whole system
Yep.
through the anxiety that comes with change and uncertainty. And
Yep.
that's where the hard work really begins.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you were talking about that, like I thought about something I said earlier that was talking about this as some new version of leadership, but it's actually not new, right? Like,
right.
Because as you were talking about this, like the person I was thinking of was Moses, right? Who was really this adaptive leader a long time ago, who was having to lead these newly freed slaves, right, to learning what it meant to be God's people, to learn to leave behind, right? So this is the lost bit, like learning to leave behind this former way of being, and then to like interrogate that gap between like, here's who we say we are, oh, but Moses is gone too long, so let's like build this golden calf and throw this party, right? Like,
right.
and like, and the reason why I find like Moses such a helpful model for adaptive leadership is because Moses never makes it to the promised land.
Yes.
Right. And so I think one of the things I've had to really wrestle with as a leader is like this understanding that I like, you know, not to make myself like Martin Luther King, but like I may not get to that destination with you.
Right.
And it's not my job as the leader to take you to the destination. It's my job here is to walk with us through the grief, through the anxiety, through all the emotions to help you as a community take that next step towards wherever God might be calling you in God's future, right?
Right.
And so like, and so separating out my own like human desire to like achieve whatever success looks like I've had to really jettison that as a leader, to take success off the table and to make something else sort of the motivating like factor underneath my leadership.
Yeah, no, I totally feel what you're saying there. And like, I think, I mean, and that's a little bit of the loss part of it, right? You know, where, and it's funny, I was just thinking about this morning because I'm really wrestling with it right now myself. So actually just really quickly for the folks who are hearing this. So right now I'm at St. Peter's in Chelsea, which is a really struggling parish. The bishop sent me here. I've brought a group of 20 people with me to help revitalize the church. And we started a little over a year ago, and we're only together for maybe like 5 months when the pandemic hit. And suddenly I'm like, this was already really hard. Like this was already gonna be a really hard endeavor before the pandemic, and now it's infinitely more so. And I've had to really wrestle during the pandemic with like, God, am I actually we left with all this hope and expectation.
Mm-hmm.
And is my role here to be to like close this down? Like, I don't even know. Like I
Yeah.
have to, but like I can't rule out that possibility.
Yeah.
And really like kind of grieving that,
Yeah.
that fact that that's even a possibility,
Yeah.
which is really, really hard. But then the thing I was thinking about this morning, that's why I bring this up, is I was just being reminded, like, at the heart of our faith is a cross,
Yeah.
and it's
Yep.
like we say this all the time, like, Jesus says all the time, if anybody
Yeah.
wants to follow after me, you have to take up your cross. But it's like, I feel like the journey of leadership, like it's the whole Philippians 2 thing. It's just
Yeah.
this continual journey downward,
Yeah.
um, into death.
Yeah.
And of course, we believe that life comes out of death, but we don't get to dictate
Yeah.
what that's going to look like.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
There
yeah.
was someone shared recently with me, the former two presiding bishops ago, Frank Griswold, came to Connecticut years and years ago and did a clergy conference where he talked about the excruciating quality of the parish leader, right? So
Mm,
excruciating, right? The cross. And like that
yeah.
has really helped me to understand, oh, this is what I'm called to in this moment, right?
Hmm.
I'm called to help folks embrace the cross in the whatever
Yeah.
that looks like.
Yeah.
Like, and our faith says like there is new life on the other side of this. We just got to get through this though. Like we have to help people
Right.
pass through this bit. um and it brought to mind sort of a midwife, right, of helping
Mm,
to birth something new, but you got to get through that pain. And that's the part
right.
that I think as
Yeah.
leaders, especially in our culture where there is such little capacity for pain, there's
Mm,
such little capacity for suffering, um,
yes.
that I think the
Yeah.
temptation is how do we minimize the suffering at all times? And I
Hmm.
think the danger in that is that we're actually minimizing the growth. We're minimizing
Yes.
the discipleship. We're
Yeah.
minimizing the change that is possible because our primary goal in the moment is to minimize the pain. So
Yeah.
one example that I'll give, and it's a small example, but I think it's worth mentioning.
Hmm.
Early on in the pandemic, all of a sudden we couldn't gather. And so the question really became about like, well, if we can't gather in person, what do we do with Eucharist? Right. And so I know
Hmm.
that there were people around the country who were doing all kinds of things with Eucharist. And I'll put it out there right now. I don't think there's a right answer to this question. I think people
Hmm.
are doing the best they can with like what they have. In
Yeah.
my own setting, though, I decided as opposed to like trying to figure out how to get Eucharist to people, let's let
Hmm.
that gap be open. Let's allow people to
Mm,
experience the sacramental longing. Let's let people
yeah.
sit in that pain
Yeah.
and let that
Yeah.
pain teach us something about God in the world right now. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know that there's like
Yeah.
a grand glorious result out of this, but I do think that there was
Yeah.
something really important to teach people and to continue to teach people in this moment about
Mhm.
we can't gather together and it's
Yeah.
not normal and it does suck and
Right.
it is hard,
Hmm.
and there
Yeah.
is something in this that we are being taught. Like if we can sit in this
Hmm.
long enough, this will teach
Yeah.
us something that we cannot learn otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is such an important point
Hmm.
about like really staying in the tension.
Yeah.
And actually, Heifetz and Linsky, they talk about this idea of creating holding environments.
Yeah.
And it's like that's a part of the adaptive leader's job, is to
Yeah.
create a holding environment that can hold that tension. And there's
Yeah.
this image of like the crock pot where it's
Yeah.
like, okay, sometimes if you want the vegetables to cook, sometimes you need to turn up the heat,
Yeah.
otherwise they're going to stay raw.
Yeah.
But then you also kind of need to also know when to turn down the heat so
Yeah.
you don't scorch the vegetables.
Sure.
And being able to kind of I think, I don't know that there's like a science to it. I
Hmm.
really think it's discernment, and
Sure. Yeah.
discernment of being able to discern, okay, this is a moment where we really do need to turn up the heat or turn down the heat.
Yeah.
But that jumping to the trying to resolve the tension for
Yeah.
people, I think is exactly right, that we actually stunt people in their growth as a
Yeah.
result.
Yeah.
And in fact, another one of the really good books that Todd talks about and that we end up reading for my class is called A Failure of Nerve by
Hmm.
Edwin Friedman.
Hmm.
Yeah, and like people either really love that book or like really hate it. I personally
I
really,
love it.
I loved it. I did too. And I think what he said about how, like, ultimately, like, leadership comes down to nerve.
Yeah.
Like, like, because being the leader who's leading change, it's like when you're dealing with not just anxious people, but a whole anxious system.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a line I think in there where it's like he talks about sabotage,
Yeah.
saying that like sabotage is something that you should expect. It's
Yeah.
just a normal part of leading change.
Yeah.
And it's not like sabotage is not what like a bad thing that evil people do. It's a
Mm-hmm.
human thing that anxious people do.
Yeah.
And sabotage can come in so many different ways. I mean, sometimes it is really aggressive and full frontal. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's much more subtle, but it's the way that the system is desperately trying to keep things at a status quo.
Yeah.
And so, Friedman makes the point that like leaders, what they do is in that moment, they can't handle the heat and
Yeah.
they can't handle the sabotage. So what they do is, he talks about how they adapt to the most, and part of why people don't like him is he uses pretty like harsh language, because like it adapts to the most immature element in the
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
And you see this happen again and again and again. And I was just talking to somebody recently who's like a senior administrator at this institution.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying, like, he said, I walked into meetings with
Mm-hmm.
like, the head of the institution where we were going in and we had to deliver hard news to the
Mm-hmm.
staff. And he was like, and I have watched that senior leader who knows what he has to do completely crumble in
Yeah.
the face of all the opposition that they
Yeah.
were getting.
Yeah.
And then he was like, and then as they were walking out, I'm like, what happened? Like,
Yeah.
we're supposed to be doing this.
Yeah.
And then because this is a Christian institution, he said that like they'll be like, well, like in the moment, I was sort of sensing that the Spirit was leading in a different direction, and that
Mm-hmm.
maybe we were jumping the gun. And so then this person I was talking to was like, we actually build a theology around our failure of nerve. You know what I mean? And it's so true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I think that was especially helpful for me when it comes to sort of the failure of nerve part, like maintaining that nerve. When we closed that conference a couple of years ago, we closed it by reading the last chapter of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' book, Lessons in Leadership. And Jonathan Sacks, I think, died this past week. So I've been sort of like living in the space of like, oh my God, like he's dead now. Like there's, but anyway, like that last chapter was about staying young, right? In the face of like all of the stuff that the leader is confronted with by a system that is anxious, by a culture that is changing, all of the stuff, right? That Moses is someone who stayed young because he remembered his ideals. He remembered his like the fundamental core of like what he was doing. And so I wonder, and maybe this is like springing this question on you, but I wonder, like, what is the value that you come back to? Like, what is the core thing that, like, when you leave a hard vestry meeting or like a super hard encounter with a parishioner, and it's like, it's just easier to walk away from all of this. What is the thing that you come back to that really sort of keeps you grounded in your role and in your work?
Yeah. I would say the main thing is being close to Christ. I know that sounds like a really sort of simplistic answer, but like, so there's this a quote by this missiologist named Leslie Newbegin that I've thought of many times, where he says the deepest motive for mission is simply the desire to be with Jesus where he is. And then it's like, if the quote just ended there, it could be this like nice, like, yes, I'm on the mountaintop with Jesus. But then he continues to be with Jesus where he is, on the frontier between the reign of God and the usurped dominion of the devil.
Yeah.
And I just remember, like, that quote has just always stuck with me, because what I realize is my temptation would be to withdraw or to give up, or to just be like, these people don't appreciate all that I'm sacrificing, all of that can come with that. But then when I come back to, okay, well, where is Jesus? And where is Jesus calling me to be with him? And if where he is on the frontier of the reign of God and the usurped dominion of the devil, that's like an intense place to be. And Jesus ended up getting killed, in that space.
Yeah.
And so I think it really ultimately for me comes down to that. And Carol Anderson, who was really instrumental in making that conference happen, she told me the other day, she said that when she was at All Angels, which is the church that I used to be at, she said she had an index card where she had written on it, God has called you here you cannot leave.
Mhm.
And she said that every day she would pull, like, she would, like, at some point during the day, she would pull that out.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about kind of the cross and
Yeah.
death. Like, I think, we say we want to follow Jesus, we say that we
Mm.
love Jesus, but when push comes to shove, it's like, are we fair with our friends?
Yeah.
And I think, like, what I kind of real like, there's that great verse in Philippians 3 where it says, I want to know Christ and the power
Yeah.
of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings.
Yeah.
And there have been many moments where I felt like Jesus was saying, there aren't a lot of people willing to share in the fellowship of my
Mm.
sufferings.
Mm.
And, like, and there's a part of me that sometimes feels guilty, even, like, thinking about, like, what I go through as a church leader as suffering, because
Mm.
there's always that comparative thing, right?
Sure. Yeah.
People in the cross
Yeah.
of the world are going through much worse things than what I'm going through right now. But it's painful, but
Yeah.
it's genuinely painful. And so I think that idea of, like, I think for me, resilience has come from that place of saying, okay, like, when I see that picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane,
Mm-hmm.
and he's asking Peter, James, and John to stay awake with him,
Yeah.
it's like, how am I going to respond? Like, will I stay awake with Jesus? And I
Yeah.
think that's the thing that kind of keeps me where I am.
Yeah. I love all of that. It's so true. One of the things that I was sharing with a colleague recently is that one of the things I've learned to embrace is sort of the broken heart of the leader, and by that I mean what it means to lead. And as a leader, like, you don't see maybe the whole destination, like, you don't see the end result, but at least you should be able to see at least a couple feet in front of you, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and you see that, like, you see that there's this potential, like, you have this hope of this destination, but you see the people that you're leading so, you know, so distracted, or so, uh, anxious, or so, fearful. And when you try to pull and cajole and inspire, and it doesn't work, and then you're faced with all this opposition, sometimes the only, like, response is just to be brokenhearted. It's
yeah,
just to be
yeah,
sad. um
yes,
and, like, and
yes.
how that's been a lot of my prayer is just like, God, I am sad. Like, during
Hmm.
COVID, and, like, everybody's anxious, and, like,
Yeah,
they keep changing, like, what phase of reopening we're in, like, we can't really be in the building, or there's all this stuff, and, like, and I get that people are anxious, and, like, it's just to be brokenhearted.
yeah, yeah.
And what you just said is to me is so appropriate, because it helps me see that, like, my brokenheartedness is not just in and of myself, but that in that brokenheartedness there is a way that I, as a leader, can now identify more with Christ, right? Granted,
Yeah,
it is not like the
yeah.
full-fledged, like you said, like, I'm not literally being crucified, like, in
Hmm.
this moment, but there's some suffering there, right? And at the level
Yeah,
of my emotion, that suffering now connects me to the heart of Jesus a bit more.
yeah,
And hopefully
yeah,
allows me to grow in compassion to the people that I am serving, in that
yeah.
given moment.
Yeah, that's right. Like, it's reminded me of, have you ever heard of this book called Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership
I
by
have
Ruth Haley
not.
Barton?
Mm-mm.
It's a really, actually, you'll love it because it's actually all about Moses.
Okay.
And she's a spiritual director, and
Hmm.
she looks at leadership through the life of Moses.
Hmm.
And like what you just said is exactly what she talks about on the chapter around intercession.
Hmm.
And so she was talking about, like, at one point, I think Moses was kind of like, Lord, just kill me now. Like, just take my life. We definitely all have those moments.
Yeah.
Right? But I was saying that, like, the thing that you notice about Moses is that, so, like, he's the only person in Scripture where the Lord, where it's said about him, and the Lord spoke with Moses as a man speaks with his friend,
Yeah.
face to face.
Yeah.
And you really see that relationship. So it's like, the brokenheartedness, or the
Hmm.
anger, or the anguish, or even the, like, God, what are you doing? Like, just kill me now.
Yeah.
But he would always bring that into conversation and into his communion with
Yeah.
the Lord.
Yeah.
And of her talking about how that's ultimately, like, what intercession
Mm.
is.
Hmm.
And it's like sharing in the heart of God and being there with God in the things that matter to
Hmm.
God,
Yeah.
and having that conversation with him. And then the other thing she said that struck me, like, at the very end, is she was talking about the moment on Mount Nebo where
Hmm.
God's basically like, you can see it but you can't go in.
Yeah.
And she was saying that to her as a leader, it feels so cruel,
Mm-hmm.
almost like after all that Moses had poured out
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
for the people of Israel, the 40 years, and then to not be able to go in.
Yeah.
She makes the point where she says, I think now she's like, I've come to peace with that story because I
Mm-hmm.
realized like after this long relationship that Moses had with the Lord, that in the end, like God was Moses's promised land. Like the presence of God was
Mm-hmm.
the promised land for Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And that at the moment where Moses has died, it's just a transition into what his heart had longed for
Yeah.
this whole
Wow.
time, and the way that he had always turned to the Lord for the Lord's presence,
Yeah.
throughout those 40 years. And it comes a little bit to like what you were talking about, of being able to like kind of let go
Yeah.
of the outcome in the end,
Yeah.
and say, okay, God, what matters most is your presence
Yeah. Yeah.
with me in all of this.
Oh God, I can talk about this all day with you. God, it's so refreshing. But I
Yeah.
wonder if you could offer any words of encouragement, any words of wisdom to people who are just stepping into leadership in the church, what would those words be?
Yeah. What would those words be? I think, and it seems I should not qualify my statements all the time, but like going back to that idea of being close to Christ,
Hmm.
um, like sometimes I kind of amaze myself at how I lose sight of that. Like, because people
Hmm.
always expect like priests, of course, priests are close to Christ,
Yeah.
but but actually no,
Yeah.
and that is often what ends up killing us.
Yeah.
And I think like just first and foremost, like making sure that the fire that is in you, that
Mm.
you are tending to that flame,
Yeah.
is so critical, because I think what we can do is we can end up fooling ourselves into thinking that we are tending that flame within
Hmm.
ourselves, when actually, because of the activities we're involved in, like
Sure.
we're preaching and we're praying and we're doing all these other things,
Hmm.
and that we can deceive ourselves.
Mm.
And so I think that is just so critical. And so even simple things like and this is like a lifelong struggle for me,
Hmm.
is
Sure.
something as simple as like Sabbath,
Yep.
like every week practicing the Sabbath, and
Yep.
where it's like at least for 24 hours,
Yep.
I am just simply a child of God,
Yep.
resting in God
Yep.
and remembering that God is God and I am not.
Yeah.
And like that part, I think is so critical.
Hmm.
I think another thing too is, so I just went through the spiritual exercises
Hmm.
with my spiritual director, and so
Hmm.
I finished it in June. And I keep on thinking about this, about discernment and
Hmm.
how important discernment is. And there's been
Yep.
this phrase in my mind that like discernment is discipleship. Like
Mm.
it's not just a practice, because one thing that Ruth Haley Barton says is that the goal of discernment is not to discern the will of God; it's to
Mm.
do the will of God.
Mm.
And so discernment is really about like, how can I hear the voice of Jesus and then do what Jesus says? And
Yeah.
that's really what disciples do. They hear the call and then
Yeah.
they obey.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and realizing, yeah, like embedded in discernment is freedom.
Yeah.
And again, I didn't think we'd be talking so much about the cross in particular, but when
Yeah.
I think about like what statement in scripture best encapsulate that spiritual freedom,
Yeah.
and I think it's what Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane,
Yeah.
like, Father, take this cup from me, and yet not what I
Yeah.
will, but what you will.
Yeah.
And I think be able to always like kind of come back to like, all right, am I really free as I'm approaching this situation or this person? Or am
Yeah.
I like tied to some particular outcome, a way
Yeah.
that I think things should be?
Yeah.
And so, especially that, just because without getting into it, there's just some things that I'm having to deal with here at St. Peter's. And I
Hmm.
realized like, oh, okay, like even in all this adaptive stuff,
Yeah.
like I could get tied to how things
Yeah.
should be,
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And I think being able to say like, okay, like I need to come to a place, and Ignatius calls it indifference, but it's just another word for freedom. Okay, can
Yeah.
I come to this place of indifference and say, all right, I'm truly free, I'm truly open. And so even when it comes to things like, as we think about, as we're talking about this, the future church,
Hmm.
I'm in lots of conversations all the time with priests trying to figure out, okay, what is the future church, especially for the Episcopal Church?
Sure.
And some people are like, it's all about innovation. We've been so tied to buildings and programs and being really clergy centric. And now we need to move into becoming more decentralized and nimble, out in the community. And I think all of that is true. But I think in the end, it comes down to, am I free enough, and are we free enough to really be open to whatever it is that God's calling us to? So maybe for some of us, God's saying, okay, we're going to do something completely different than what the church has been doing before. But there may be some people who are like, they're actually called to still steward a building and program people. But it's a matter of, can we really hear and be open to what that could look like?
Yeah. Christine, you are a fount of wisdom. Thank you so much. And I'm sure you and I will be talking again, on all kinds of things. This whole thing started because I kept having these conversations with you and a bunch of other leaders around the church, and was just like, I need other people to know that these inspiring and challenging and wonderful and spirit-filled conversations are happening. So thank you for being part of it. And we will be talking soon.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. I always love talking to you.
Thank you, Christine. Have a good day.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It is always such a pleasure to talk to folks like Christine, who are doing this incredibly transformative leadership work all throughout the church. Now, the next step for us is actually to begin reading a book that you heard mentioned in that conversation, Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. It looks like this. This book was incredibly instrumental in helping me understand how adaptive leadership can help create the kind of container that will allow our communities to embrace change and transformation by asking deep questions, uncovering hidden truths, and charting a new path forward. Now, to close, I want to read an excerpt from this book that will hopefully whet your appetite for more. The church is at an exciting crossroad. We are entering a new day, new terrain, and a new adventure. We are not alone. The Spirit of God goes before us. The mission of Christ will not fail. A day will come when the kingdom of the world will become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. The next steps are going to be demanding. More than anything, this moment requires those of us in positions of authority, and even most of us who are not, to embrace an adventure or die mindset and find the courage and develop the capacity for a new day. We are heading into uncharted territory and are given the charge to lead a mission where the future is nothing like the past. Be well, friends.